And the key learning from that process was that there was a strong desire to create a culturally competent or agile community to attract leaders of color to live and work here. And from a student's perspective, to be educators and to engage with them in their learning journey as well. And so in the fall of 2019, that was our first step. And then in the fall of 2019, the administration team and many different school leadership teams visited the Equity Innovation Center in downtown Minneapolis. And so what that is an interactive experience that we built in partnership with the Science Museum of Minnesota. And it gives an experience around culture and race and history. And so we use that experience to be reflective for the leaders and how they develop their next steps for making their student experiences inclusive and enhancing their work as leaders implementing Policy 105, equity, access, and excellence in education. So we talked about the characteristics of culturally relevant schools using a lens of belonging and what changes might be necessary to create a culture of belonging so that all of the students could thrive. So that was the first engagement there. And then in the spring of 2020, we put together a plan that would move the work of the community forward, engaging the chamber and the city and the school. And so the city of Burnsville rolled out our Transforming Workplace Culture series with their leadership teams and directors this past fall. And we took many of their team through an 8-session process of understanding those concepts around belonging, around inclusion, around equity, and also around systems change. And then the chamber started their journey as well with a session at their board retreat last fall. And then the city council for Burnsville started out with 2 initial sessions this late fall of 2020 around the topic of leading into the future. And a brief hiatus with the COVID spike that happened at the end of the year. And now we're going to be re-engaging this spring with 3 follow-up sessions that's going to be enhancing their ability to lead with inclusion and belonging and equity as city council members and how they interact with their community and understanding the levels and complexity of equity and inclusion. And so the work that's occurring in the school and in the community is really supporting that framework of culturally proficient schools. It's recognizing culture, it's valuing diversity, it's how to manage and adapt to those dynamics of difference, and also institutionalizing cultural agility. Or another way that we say that too is that moving things forward to say so that equity, access, and excellence isn't something we do, but it becomes who we are. And so that's the space that we have been moving on with different organizations in Burnsville. And I would like to invite all of you to join in on that journey too, bringing with you those existing learning and experiences that you had as board members to deepen those discussions and opportunities to enhance that equity lens that you're already using and growing from and learning as council or as school board members together. So that might entail engaging in a learning experience similar to that of the city council of leading into the future, or it might be participating in a visit to our United Health Group Equity Innovation Center in downtown Minneapolis, as many of your school leadership and school teams have already done. Or it might even be starting the journey with an intercultural development inventory assessment. The IDI assessment's a tool that shows you how to navigate that subjective cultural differences that we encounter and provides a development plan that gives us a roadmap to deepen those skills around cultural agility or cultural proficiency in that light. So we could work with you to find those dates that might work best and assemble a plan that might enhance your ability to setting direction of the district and deepen your own ability to see and remove barriers for student success in the form of those policies and plans as you envision the next future for Burnsville schools together. But it's been a work that has been in progress with the many different conversations within the community. And I know that's something you all have been watching as well, and growing together in your work as you've been doing your work around culturally proficient schools. So that's a quick overview of what's been happening and our role with it. And would just like to make sure that you have that invitation to join us along in that journey as a team, and we'd be honored to be able to work with you in that capacity going forward too.
Well, thank you, Mr. Peterson. Board members, are there any questions or comments from Mr. Peterson? Director Word, you have your hand raised.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation, first and foremost. I actually had been speaking with the city last summer and learned about their partnership with the Y in this program. So I was very excited to hear this presentation and learn about, you know, what you've been working on. So very, very excited to hear about what you're doing. But I do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
So like where I know, because one of my biggest questions I'd had for Mayor Couts is that the city of Burnsville doesn't really have an equity plan right now. Is that something that you're still working on? Is that something that's going to be laid out at some point? Because I know you briefly said something about an equity plan, but you didn't, you know, say where are you somewhere in the middle of working on that? Because it seems like it's kind of been a really long process to get to this point.
Yeah, and you know, so much of this work, it is a journey, and it takes laying some groundwork. And so the work that we've been doing with them has been laying that groundwork and foundation for some of those aspirations that they want to have moving forward. So I'm sure they're going to continue to have those conversations about what that next iteration is for them, and what does that look like. But I know there's been additional work of in other spaces that for the city about, you know, what does an access plan look like? What does equity look like here in our community? And so I'm sure there'll be some outflows that will resemble some more concrete efforts for them as they go forward as well.
Okay, so have they talked about a racial equity plan at all? I mean, is that something, you know,
that would be something I think that would be a better conversation to talk with their leadership about, and what their plans and aspirations are for that. That'd be something that would be appropriate conversation for them to identify.
Okay, and so with the kind of work that you're doing, do you have any like equity type training that you do as part of it?
Yeah, so we have a couple of different learning paths that we go on. So when we're working with teams, we have a series that we call our Equity Leadership Institute, and that's a 5-session process that goes through cultural agility, that goes through understanding dimensions of diversity and identity, understanding dimensions of culture, microaggressions, and implicit bias, and then understanding culture, history, and race in that context. We also have another one that is transforming culture, which is what the city started with and was part of the original plan that we talked about last spring. And that is an 8-part series that has some of those similar components, but also adds into some pieces around systems change and creating action steps for a leadership team to navigate. And then the third one that we do is called Leading into the Future, which we've been doing those with some boards and also smaller leadership teams. That really it's a 3-part series that goes through a process of identifying the current landscape, those realities and identities and culture. And then another part that goes into skills for those new landscapes, thinking about understanding bias and belonging. And then a third component then that gets into, well, how do we create that new landscape, a culture that's truly built for all? And so those are some different learning paths that we can deliver, and we can engage individuals to create their own journey together and customize those pieces based on where their group and team is at.
That's great. So that could be tailored towards like a school board, or could it be used also in like schools themselves?
Absolutely. We've been doing some work with several school districts around the Twin Cities, working with their leadership teams, working with their school teams, and helping them look at things with a lens of equity and inclusion in their own district.
Great. Okay. Thank you. That was all the questions I had. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Director Connor, you have your hand raised. You're on mute, Director Connor.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes, I'm also very happy to hear about this program. I think it's awesome and it's going in the right direction. I'm just curious, how do we get in touch with the program managers or anyone if we want to find out more about it or even participate?
Yeah, Dr. Battle has been working very closely with our Chief Social Responsibility Officer, Dr. Hetty Walls. And so they've been maintaining a very close relationship in regards to the work that we can do. And so I'm sure that's something we can enhance or have some additional conversation about what that might look like for a plan for the Burnsville district.
Okay, awesome.
So Director Connor,
Mhm.
wanted to add on to that, Chair Miller and directors of the board. And so Stephanie White and Amina Oftedal are here too, if they would like to add, but we engage with the YMCA as part of our equity plan. So our framework is CPSS, but as Scott mentioned, we have school teams, executive leadership team, clerks, I believe custodians and other staff groups went through the Equity Innovation Lab. And so,
I can,
and then board,
jump in.
just one more thing, Stephanie. And so the three entities in Burnsville, the chamber, the city, and the district, had a discussion about whether we should have some common pieces. So we have an equity plan, we have a framework. The chamber had not had conversations, so they are really starting this conversation. And the city had some inclusion and belonging work through Know Thy Neighbor. And so this is about where do we want to be in alignment with our other two entities. But go ahead, Stephanie, correct me.
Good. And oh, there we go. Thank you. My video wasn't working. I just wanted to just reiterate, hi Scott, the partnership that we had with the YMCA was transformative and really aligned with the work that we do with our culturally proficient school systems. When we got to bring groups down and present with them, we were able to collaborate together. And so they would present some, we would present some, and then work very closely with teams in order to continue the work and that inside out approach of that reflective process and really learning how to about our own mindsets and how that, you know, really aligns with the work that we do with students and families. And so can't say enough about the partnership with the Y and how much I value that in the work that we do.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Stephanie, did you also collaborate with people of color on this program?
Well, Hetty Walls is one of the leaders, and she they also have other members of color on their leadership team as well. So yes, yep, absolutely. And if you haven't had a chance to meet Hetty, we've got to make that happen. She's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tony.
Director Ault, you have your hand raised. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair Miller. I think this is great. I think it'll be knowing that our senior leadership has already worked in the equity lab, and Dr. Battle, you're kind of introducing this as, you know, an element under the CPSS umbrella under which we work. I think all up for doing this. I think the question is really which elements are going to be best for the school board to undertake, and what kind of time commitment we have, what kind of cost is involved, which I would certainly leave to the officers and Dr. Battle to kind of cull through that information and maybe come, obviously this is an opportunity for us to provide our input. I think a deep dive would be great. I think, whether it's 3 sessions or 8 sessions, we all stand to benefit from it. And it's certainly in alignment with, I like being in alignment with what our students are doing too. So I guess, really knowing that, and Dr. Battle, you touched on this too, that we're kind of all working, each of the chamber, the city, and the school district are kind of working in parallel tracks, trying to get through, working through to an equity, culture of equity, and the fact that we're collaborating, even if it's just with some overlap here and there. It's really reassuring. So positive support for this.
Thank you.
Any other board member comments or questions? Well, thank you again, Mr. Peterson. Do appreciate presentation, and yes, I echo much of what was said tonight with the work you're doing in our community. And just to be very clear for our board and the audience level, Mr. Peterson tonight made an offer for individual training usage opportunities and such, and by all means, and we have some new board members who sometimes are a little not quite sure about what they should or shouldn't be doing or whatever. That is absolutely opportunities you should be taking advantage of. Any kind of board level collaboration or training sessions or whatever, we'll explore those. I've not seen any kind of proposals or offers at this time for anything like that. So that'll come through Dr. Battle, and we will take a look at those and see how they fit again with our CPSS framework, which is the core of what we're doing in the district here.
Yep. So Chair Miller, Scott Peterson, and Hetty Walls will give me the proposals that they shared with the City of Burnsville and Mayor and City Council, as well as the Chamber. So this was just a report to get everyone up to speed and what the Chamber and the city had done. But yes, absolutely, we'll have that information, as Director Alt said, and look at the elements and what pieces you would like to bring forward and participate in.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, thank you again, Mr. Peterson, for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Next on our agenda in the information section of our meeting, we are going to move to a report about the final single audit schedule and Minnesota legal compliance from full year 20. Presenting tonight is Dennis Hugoven and Lucas Chase from Clifton Larson Allen LLP. Gentlemen, I'll let you have the microphone.
All right, thank you. There we go. My name is Dennis Hogeveen. I'm engagement principal with Clifton Larson Allen. Tonight I did have Lucas Chase, the manager on the audit, stop by with me. We don't have any formal presentation prepared or anything like that. You will recall, for those board members that were on here sitting on the board last November, we did the audit for the district's CAFR in November. And at that time, I reported to you that we had a little bit of an unusual situation in that the single audit of the district couldn't be completed at that time because the guidance to complete the single audit couldn't be prepared because the CARES funding didn't have the guidance issued from the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget hadn't issued the guidance that we needed to do the audit specifically related to the CARES funding. That was issued around the end of the year, December, late in the year, around Christmas time, as I recall. So then the audit for the single audit could be completed in January and was issued actually in February. And then since that time, we have a few new board members joining the school board. And so just for purposes of familiarity in that process, this is highly unusual. Normally the audit is all one nice little package that's done in one complete 175-page various documents. So this is a little bit unusual that we're coming to you in March to present a single audit as a separate document. The document that you have in front of you has 3 different formal letters and as part of it. 2 of the 3 letters were already issued as a separate report back in November. So in that report, there's a letter that's called what we call the Yellow Book letter. It's government auditing standards. That was issued back in November. There were no findings as part of that letter. And then the 3rd letter in that document is the Minnesota Legal Compliance letter. That letter was also issued back in November. There was one finding in there that had a similar finding to the prior year. We've already discussed that with the board. The corrective action plan's already in there, so we're not going to re-review that. The only new letter that's in this year's single audit, that's in this year's report that we're presenting to you tonight, is the single audit. And there's a listing in there. If you look into that report, there's a listing of all the $9 million worth of the federal expenditures that the district had for fiscal year 20. The fiscal year ended June 30th, 20. And so $9 million is detailed in there, and part of that is that CARES funding that we were referring to earlier. And there was one finding that was similar to the prior year. Last year, the finding was under the same typical finding that probably the most common finding that we have been finding for other school districts related to procurement was similar last year for 2019, but it was under the child nutrition program. This year was also procurement, but it related to special education. And that's not uncommon when you have new things that came down in fiscal 18, that it takes a couple of years to cycle through and get all those things incorporated into your methodologies and things like that. And the other thing we wanted to point out is that doesn't mean those things weren't happening. It's just a documentation issue. And I think the corrective action plan or the findings kind of makes a point of making an issue that it's more of a documentation issue. So it's almost a technicality. It's from an auditor's perspective. It's just a documentation thing that we have to report that as a finding. But there were some really good questions raised from one or more board members. So there was a set of questions that were asked that were already responded to as part of the materials that were routed as part of the materials for tonight's board meeting. So hopefully that answered some of the questions that might have been out there. But to the extent there were other questions, that's why Lucas and I stopped by the meeting tonight to see if there were any other questions that we could respond to. But basically it's just to say hello and transmit that formal document to you and stand by for any questions. Maybe I'll let Lucas chime in and say hello and see if he had anything to add that I didn't already respond to. But other than that, we'll see if there were any other questions that we could respond to.
Yeah, nothing too much to add. I would clarify it was suspension and debarment, which is it's closely related to procurement, right? So the procurement's kind of like in the purchasing and suspension department, which the finding was related to, has some related compliance issues, but it's looking to make sure that they're not on a list excluding them from being able to provide the service. Otherwise, I didn't have anything else.
Thank you for clarifying. And now everybody knows why I always bring Lucas along, so that he always keeps me honest when I present things. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. Our board members, are there any questions this time for the gentleman? Director Alt, you have your hand raised?
Not a question, just a comment. I appreciate the distinction between in the fact that this was kind of a documentation error as opposed to an actual action error. And I think that's an important distinction to make, that, and I appreciate having you both come to kind of provide the human context around the audit report, because the additional comments that you provide really help improve at least my understanding of the significance of what we're looking at. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Any other board members? No. Seeing none, thank you, gentlemen, for your time this evening. I know, well, needed to be done, and to some degree it's a little bit of a formality, but I appreciate you taking time in your evening for this. It demonstrates the ongoing relationship we have with your firm. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us. And
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I thought maybe I heard another question started, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Next in our agenda for this evening is to have a presentation on an update about the full year 2022 budget adjustments. This presentation will be given by Dr. Battle, our superintendent, and Lisa Ryder, Executive Director of Business Services. You may go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Miller, directors of the board. So tonight, we are going to bring you an update for the development of our fiscal 22 budget. We will have some updates concerning federal funding. We will review the historical information from our initial budget adjustments. We have an updated proposal, and then we'll end with some next steps. And so I'll turn it over to Lisa Ryder, and Aaron will bring up the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Battle. As has been mentioned on the next slide of the overview, these are the items that we'll cover this evening. And so as we move to the next slide, the federal funding update that we have for you at this time is this is ever changing. Every day we wait to see for more information, and they indicated, MDE, Minnesota Department of Education, indicated that by the end of this week, we would be learning more about our allocation for the CARES 2 funds, or otherwise sometimes people call it ESSER 2 funds. And so we know that the approval has been received, and so now it's about the allocations being communicated to each individual school district and what that might look like. It is our intention, as you see on this slide, that we will utilize our CARES 1 funds in this fiscal year. Should there be any remaining, we'll move those forward to next year, but I believe they will be largely used in FY21. As we move into FY22 and our conversation, that's where we're referring to our CARES 2 funds being utilized heavily for our purposes related to COVID and our recovery from the pandemic. So as we take a look at the next slide, the strategies for building our budget is to prioritize these investments. Our strategies for building the budget revolve around the goal of protecting our programming, our staffing and services so we can provide stability to our students. Our strategies for doing that at this time will be to maintain the 6% unassigned fund balance goal that the board has, prioritizing the investments we're making in our pre-K-12 pathways model, including our programming and services, maximizing the use of our federal pandemic relief funds and our restricted fund balances and our unassigned fund balance. Basically, we want to make sure that we are getting the greatest possible use of the funds that we have available to us. So as we move to the next slide, here's what that looks like. And when you think back to our starting point, as we started talking about FY22 budget, and in the most recent meeting, you saw this slide with the number 1 and 2 listed here. And the challenge we're trying to meet is to address a $10.86 million projected deficit for next year. So when we right size for enrollment, we expect to reduce our spending by $1.25 million. We then can cover $5.71 million of that deficit with the fund balances that the board can commit and assign. And finally, we expect to be able to use $3.9 million of your federal pandemic aid The two combinations of the federal aid and the use of the fund balances are what allows us to provide that stability, which is a priority as we move through the pandemic. So on the next slide, this is the number 3 and 4 that you saw last meeting as of March 11th. These are what those slides look like. And I'm going to talk a little further about these as we move forward. So the next slide shows again that amount of 10, oh wait one moment for the next slide. 10.86 million, as we mentioned, is the deficit we're projecting for FY22 that we need to address. So as we talked about the 1.25 million previously, that was the number 1 identified. We are not looking at cutting programs and services as you look at this slide. We are proposing to maintain the class sizes, spend down the fund balance, and use our federal resources to balance the FY22 proposed budget. Once again, we are not looking at cutting programs and services, but rather proposing to maintain that class size, spend down the fund balance, and use federal resources to balance the FY22 budget. So as we move to the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about the details around maintaining class size. In review of the staffing at the elementary, secondary, and support service level, the assumptions at this time indicate a total of 25 full-time equivalents of various positions as outlined on this slide. The next slide talks about the strategy of the use of fund balance. This is the detailed list of savings that we expect in the current year. So basically, we budgeted money for these items that are listed here, but we do not expect to spend them in the current year. In most cases is due to the change or because of the pandemic. So what we're proposing is to take these amounts out of the current year budget, reduce the expenditure budget by these amounts, so that they are then shown in the projected fund balance for the end of this year. Then we can plan to spend those dollars as we look at the FY22 budget. We'll start with a fund balance that includes those funds. We will bring before you as the board these and any other adjustments that we have identified to the board in April as an amendment to the current revised budget. One thing I do want to point out is on this slide, this list does not mean that we're spending less during the pandemic. It's just that our needs have shifted. So we're spending more on health and safety equipment, on staff so we can reduce class sizes, and on many other things that are eligible for the federal funds, CARES 1. But because our learning model is so different, we're spending less in some areas like field trips or supplies. So as we go to the next slide, just as a reminder, in the past, we have used the strategy of using fund balance to assist in developing budgets. So this is not exactly a new tool to us. This slide reminds us that 4 years ago, when we relied heavily on the use of fund balance when developing the fiscal year 18 adopted budget. Circumstances then were such that we had enough fund balance to cover the entire deficit. Currently, we will be relying upon the use of our ESSER 2 funds that we understand will be available to us July 1st. As we look to the next page, or slide, we do plan to use fund balance to the extent necessary to cover the FY22 deficit, and we anticipate the availability of the ESSER 2 funds, which are planned to be used partially to fund existing costs up to the amount of $3.9 million within the fiscal year 22 budget. Next slide. We are still taking input from staff and families as we have previously. We're asking them about their priorities and their ideas about efficiencies. As of March 18th, we've received 21 responses. Obviously, that's not enough responses to make any statistical claims, but anecdotally, they do reflect the support for the district's pathways model and student support services. Next slide. With that, I just want to review the process. So tonight, our general timeline tonight, we're reporting on the proposed FY22 fiscal year 22 budget. And later in a workshop environment, the board may have further discussion. In April, we'll be bringing staffing recommendations for board approval and revisions to the current year budget to reflect the carryover that would move to FY22, fiscal year 22. June, we will require, in the month of June, we'll require board action to waive the current 8% fund balance policy, to assign or commit fund balance, and to officially adopt the budget. As I mentioned during the presentation, there are a couple of procedural actions that the board would need to take, and so those will take place in the month of June. With that, that's the last of our slides, and I just would like to thank you for the opportunity to present this proposal for FY22 budget.
Thank you, Ms. Ryder. I'll ask at this point if board members have any questions or desire clarification on the presentation that was just given. I will remind you, as Lisa alluded to, we will have a workshop at the end of our regular scheduled meeting tonight to delve into deeper this presentation and discuss our perspectives on it and such. So not that I'm trying to limit anything, but just keep in mind questions at this time, probably more clarification for the public or us on something you heard that you maybe didn't quite understand. And we'll get into the details shortly later this evening. So having said that, are there any desire for clarification? Yes, Dr. Chester, you have your hand raised.
Thank you, Chair Miller. My question, or not question, well, maybe clarification would be under helping the community, even some of us as board members, understand the carryover that's being projected. So my understanding is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that we have revenue to cover, current revenue to cover the expenses that we are not projecting to use that we would then carry over to next fiscal year. So like there's revenue able to pay for these expenses should we have needed to expend them. And therefore, but because we don't need to expend them, we have this revenue and the projected expense for next year that could be pushed to next year, right?
Yes, thank you for that question. The clarification that's needed here. The revenue that we proposed in our budgets, we are not looking to shift or change that at this time for the current year, because that's based largely on enrollment, and there's not been a significant enrollment shift from our assumptions adopted or revised. So the revenue will not change. However, by reducing the expenditure budgets for these items listed, that then means that your revenue less the then expenditures will be greater, meaning that there won't be a spend down of fund balance near like what we talked about, and instead you'll be adding to the fund balance projected. And that projection, moving that forward, becomes your beginning fund balance as we give you the documents in June for the planning of the FY22 budget. By making approval of that in April, the board then can clearly see that already having been approved and can use that as an assumption in looking at the next year's budget. Thank you.
Director Werb, you have your hand raised.
So this may have been in one of the slides from past meetings, but I didn't see it included in this slide deck. With this projected budget, what is the impact on our future fiscal year's budgets with this scenario? How does it impact our future year for fund balance?
Thank you, Director Werb. That is a good question. The reason you're not seeing that is because we have so many assumptions that are being based upon assumptions at this moment. As we learn more about our ESSER 3 funds, that was on the one slide as well. I didn't talk much about it because it's been approved at the federal level, but we have not yet at the state level seen our approval. So we know that our FY22 budget will largely rely upon our ESSER 2 funds. And they had indicated amount, which is the amount that I'm utilizing in our projections for this next year. But for the fiscal year 23 and beyond, we would look to utilize the ESSER 3 funds. Unfortunately, at this moment, I don't have an amount to even indicate. So therefore, it's hard to put that into a projection and give you any solid information at this time. But as soon as we learn that estimate, then we can begin that planning of those second and third year out.
And Director Werb, I'd like to add the other major assumption that we hope to have more information is our per pupil amount from the state. And so an update we wanted to share, well, I'll do it now, but in the workshop. So we had the governor's proposal, now both the House and Senate have submitted their bills. And so we hope we'll know we can go from 0 to another number for that assumption too.
Okay, thank you.
Any other clarification questions at this time? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Lisa, for that presentation. Now we will move to the next item in our information part of our agenda this evening, and that is to receive an update about District 191's efforts to implement COVID-19 related educational and public health guidance issued by the MDE and the MDH, respectively. This will be Dr. Battle.
Thank you, Chair Miller, directors of the board. So tonight, staff and I will share information related to health and safety, our secondary learning model for middle school and high school, and also prom and graduation updates. And so first I'll share the county data released for confirmed cases for 14 days. The 14-day period represents February 28th through March 13th. Dakota County is at 27.02, which is an increase from 25.71. And Scott County has increased 37.52, which is a significant increase from the 27.34. Joining me tonight to share some information will be Bernie Bean, our lead licensed school nurse, and she'll share a little bit about the analysis of the county's data, also our local 191 data, an update regarding our participation in Minnesota's vaccine program and our required mitigation strategies. And then following Bernie, we'll have Assistant Superintendent Brian Gersich, who will give updates about our secondary learning model, as well as what we've learned for guidance for venues for prom and graduation. So I'll turn it over to Bernie.
Thank you, Dr. Battle. Good evening, Board of Directors and Chair Miller. For that 14-day rate, both Dakota County and Scott County do project that the rates will be higher next week. And part of that is due to the presence of the variant that is starting to be identified in both counties. The positivity rate for Dakota County went up to 5.2 from 4.2. For Scott County, the positivity rate increased from 7.6, and it was at currently at 7.6. Last week it was 4.7. The state positivity rate is 4.0. Throughout the state, they have been doing random sampling of COVID specimens to determine where the variants are and what the rates might be. The numbers that they publish are still very low, are estimated at the low end because it is a random sampling. Currently in Minnesota, they have samples of 479 of the B117 variant. And then in addition, 108 of the variants that were originated in California. So the variants are in our communities, and we are starting to see some impact on the community level with that. For Dakota County specific data, their 7-day average of positive rates is 113. This is the highest rate that they have seen since October 29th, 2020. Scott County is seeing an increase in the rates of the 15 to 19-year-olds, where Dakota County is seeing it in the 5 to 9-year-olds. So a little bit different presentation for both counties. For our local data, during the 14-day time period, which was February 28th through March 13th, Health Services completed 5 investigations for individuals that were deemed positive and infectious in our school building. The time frame before that, we had 1 investigation for a positive individual in our buildings. Our number will also go up next week and should stay about the same the following week. And then hopefully we'll start to see a little bit downward tick. But then we have spring break and we have variants that kind of make the equation a little bit more complex, right? So, you know, COVID fatigue is real. And we all need to see some hope, a glimmer of positive that we're going in the right direction. And this one statistic, I feel, shows that. The positive long-term care cases for the last week in Dakota County was 1. That means for the last month, they have only had 4 positive cases in long-term care. If you compare that to what it was pre-COVID vaccination, they were receiving 10 to 15 positive cases in long-term care facilities a day. The vaccine is our glimmer of hope right now. The vaccination coverage in Dakota County for those that have completed their first dose is at 24%, which is an increase from the following week. And those that have completed the full series is at 13.5%. Next week, Dakota County will begin using Metcalf as an administration site for 3 days, starting March 31st. This space will allow them to vaccinate 1,800 individuals per day. The partnership with Dakota County really helps us move forward in the race between the virus and the vaccine. Last week, during the investigations that were completed by Health Services, we started to see the positive impact of vaccinations. Currently, the guidance indicates that a close contact that is 2 weeks post-vaccination and within 90 days does not need to quarantine unless symptoms develop. CDC and MDH, their operational definition of close contact has not changed throughout the pandemic. And that definition is a close contact is any person who has been within 6 feet of a person who has been positive for COVID for a total of 15 minutes or more throughout the course of the day or that exposure. In the next 2 weeks, staff that received vaccinations through Dakota County under the education tier will be completing the 2nd dose. That means by the last week in April, staff that are determined to be a close contact potentially will not have to quarantine. During the month of April, we are hopeful that face shields, which is a mitigation strategy that is used by staff, can begin to be phased out. COVID is not going away. And we know vaccines are not 100% effective and not available for some individuals and for our students yet. As a district and a community, we do need to remain vigilant in adhering to those mitigation strategies. Our district is doing an amazing job. And even though numbers are going up, we are really doing an amazing job. And that's because of the partnership between home, school, and our community stakeholders. Together, we are stronger, and we will get through this. COVID is challenging, but keeping health and safety as a priority, which we have, we will make it through this. I am going to turn it over to Brian at this time.
Thanks, Bernie. And good evening, Chair Miller and Dr. Battle and Board of Directors. Thanks for an opportunity to give you a couple of updates. As Dr. Battle said, I'll start with some updates about our planning for a shift in learning models for our middle school and high school. At the previous board meeting, I did talk about how that team has met a number of times, meeting number 13 yesterday, to make sure that we're prepared. We did have a target and have continued to have a target of being ready to make that transition by April 12th. As Bernie just talked about, there's a little bit of a reality check, I think, in there with where we're at with the cases and COVID rising in the community that we serve. And so while that team, again, continues to assert that its position is to be ready, certainly I would look at that group as having some hesitation about April the 12th, and certainly deferring to the COVID advisory group that works with Dr. Battle on Fridays to review numbers, and knowing that that group has really wanted to see trends in data. The trends right now suggest that it's probably more realistic that we're looking at the week of April the 19th, or even into the week of April 26th. And again, as we look at where we are with cases right now, for the longest time, it seemed like cases were trending down. And now the rolling 14-day average is the highest it's been in a month and a half. And a lot of the other data that I won't repeat that Bernie just shared would suggest that trend data would not necessarily be there as we're heading into spring break with those kinds of numbers. Had we seen a continued steady pattern of declines, I'd feel more confident right now, because we were seeing this uptick in projections that don't match the narrative that we would like to see. I just like to offer that April 12th is becoming more unrealistic, and pushing back a week or another couple of weeks is becoming more and more the reality that we have to really prepare for. A couple of other realities of assumptions that I wanted to make sure that the board was aware of that we've kind of discussed over the last couple of weeks since the previous board meeting. And when I say assumptions, it simply means these are the realities we have to accept when we make the decision to go into in-person learning for middle school and high school. The first one related to transportation would be that because of the number of routes, buses, drivers, we'd have to accept that our buses are going to be much fuller and closer to about 45 students on a bus. We're talking about 2 per seat. And as Bernie had talked before, close contact is still considered within 6 feet. So if you put 2 per seat and are not in the same household, you have a number of close contacts. We talked about that concern last week when we just talked about the rows and columns of our desks in the classroom. Another assumption is that students would need to eat within 6 feet. If we're going to be setting up all of our classrooms and also thinking about our lunchrooms, it is impractical to think we're going to be able to do that at the middle school and high school and try to maintain 6 feet. So again, that means we're accepting that students are going to be probably closer to that 4-foot range, which is where we'd be setting our desks. And of course, eating is taking off your mask to do so. So again, that's another assumption and a reality we have to be prepared for when we make that decision, or if the decision is made to go back to full in-person. And again, just to clarify that, because I know it did come up in the community, that just last week, the CDC did release their discussion points about schools, that schools were able to establish settings where students are within 3 feet. 3 feet is the new minimum. And I just like to point out that is what we've been doing in Minnesota, but MDH still has not changed the consideration for close contact. And so I think that's part of it too, is to make sure that the idea of bringing our middle school and high school students back to in-person is getting more days of learning in person, going to school instead of alternating Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, every day. But what we don't want to lose is if we have students full in school for 2 weeks, and then students need to quarantine for 2 weeks, over that 4-week span, they've had exactly the same number of days in person, and we've lost the consistency and the routines that our kids have right now. And I know that our team would emphasize, we're very proud of the hybrid model that we've been offering to our students. We know in-person would be better. We all want it to be there. But we also want to make sure that our kids are safe. We're not increasing spread in the community. We're not creating inconsistencies and lack of predictability because we've done it too quickly. So again, we do continue to support what I know the COVID advisory group has been advising Dr. Battle on, which is, caution and safety, and making sure that we do this deliberately, which again, I believe this district has done from the very beginning. So those are some of the things as to what we're looking at right now for in-person learning updates for secondary, middle school, and high school. And then just a couple of fun things to update you on, which are special events for high schools, prom and graduation. Our team has been working consistently on this, but it's been taking some time, but we've been waiting for guidance from the Department of Health and Department of Education, knowing that they had planned on some things coming. And very recently, the Department of Health released guidance based on venues, which was used to interpret some of the guidance for prom and graduation. And it's continued to evolve. In fact, just yesterday, there was another webinar from the Department of Health that got a little more specific about prom and graduation guidance. So what I'm just sharing with you right now is what we're thinking. A lot can happen in a month. COVID determines really what's going to end up being the plan. Graduation is nearly working very hard to make this as special as we can for students for both prom and for the prom. So it would be seniors only. They're also talking about splitting prom into two groups and potentially having a 5 to 7 and a 9 to figure out different ways you could keep students in pods to at least limit the exposure from some planning still to kind of figure out with the venue, but they're working hard to offer this experience so that it can be there for our students, but doing it in a safe way. You know, again, refreshments like bottled water and other things that, you know, again, would take that to the team and make sure that I get some kind of an update related to the AVID graduation.
That'd be great. Thank you. And I know, you know, speaking as one member of this board, I am certainly happy to do whatever it takes to help make graduation happen for our seniors. It was unfortunate that last year's seniors missed out on that. And, you know, if it means attending a couple graduation ceremonies, then, you know, it's all for the kids, and I'm happy to do that. I don't think I had just a comment. I know that, you know, staff has really been doing a great job. You know, of course, mandated to wear masks and face shields and trying to make light of it. So, you know, hearing that there might actually be a light at the end of the tunnel with putting the face shields to rest, I think folks will be happy to have that happen. So thank you very much. It was a really great report, as always.
Thank you.
Looks like our student representative, Milkame Addisue, has her hand raised. Is that intentional, Milkame?
Yeah, I just had a question about graduation. Would this split graduation be on both days, just a few hours apart?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So again, the current iteration would have them the same evening. I think what they've been looking at right now as a tentative would be to have a ceremony at 4 o'clock and one at 7 o'clock, about a 1 hour ceremony, so that there's about 2 hours in between. And I think one of the things we learned from the webinar yesterday is they want to make sure that you've got time. We would have to section off to keep families 6 feet apart. And so giving enough time for people to get in and for people to exit. What really makes them nervous is that transition time, the time in between when people would typically linger. And if we've all been to graduation ceremonies, that's one of the fun parts is talking, but we need to make sure we get people safely in and safely out. So it would be the same evening with, again, 1 hour ceremonies, 2 hours in between to try to reset and get people in and out.
Thank you.
Milko, may I add the other requirement we have to plan for? MDH views the graduations as a ticketed event. So we'd have to have assigned seats. And so that's new. And so that's another piece that we learned about yesterday too. So the team will keep working.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Excellent. Director Hume, you did have your hand, I believe, briefly. Do you wish to ask a question?
My question was just asked, so I'm good now.
Excellent. Okay, I see no more hand raised, so thank you, Dr. Battle and Assistant Superintendent Gersich for your presentation. Now we will move to the committee board appointment and school assignment report section of our evening for board members. So again, to remind you, we do a rotating, alternating schedule. So tonight would be specific to any committee assignments or board appointments that you are involved with. So I won't use the hand function if you'd like to go ahead and start out. Director Chester.
Thank you, Chair Miller. I do not have anything to report for the Legislative Committee. We did have that special report at the beginning of last board meeting, but I do have a report from Intermediate District 917. So during February and March, regular business continued with 917, such as policy reviews, updates on the various programs as they navigate through the pandemic and work on the new 2021-2022 budget. Highlights of the 2 months included the approval of naming the Concord Education Center's training room to the Joe Lewis Training Center. Joe Lewis was the long-term chair of 917 who passed away in June from cancer, but most importantly has been the work of finding, well, most importantly right now, currently even today, is finding the new superintendent, as current superintendent Mark Zizix will be retiring at the end of June. District 917 selected Minnesota School Board Association to be its search firm to assist in its finding and selecting its next superintendent. And this week and next week, starting today and concluding tomorrow, are interviews being held for the semifinalists via Zoom. And on Monday, the finalists will be interviewed followed by the selection of the candidate of choice. And if anybody is interested in following the interviews and board discussion, there's a link on the homepage for 917. The website is www.isd917.k12.mn.us. And we'll hopefully have more to report in terms of the successful selection next month. And that concludes my report.
Thank you. Director Connor, you have your hand raised.
Yes, just a few highlights from the AMSD meeting that was held on March 19th. Sorry, I had to clear my throat. Just some highlights from that. The proposal to require mental health instruction to lessen disciplinary proficiencies or policies, I'm sorry, for expulsion and expansion from school. They may have touched on that last time, but they were saying more that they really need to, they're trying to keep kids in school as opposed to suspending them and having them miss more school. And then they gave some examples of that, which I won't go through, but they're pretty interesting how they're trying, how they sometimes want to suspend kids, even though they're doing the distance learning. Another little important fact that I thought was interesting, it was tobacco uses decline for high school and middle school students during COVID year. It was 26.4%, and now it's down to 20.5. President Biden did sign a $1.9 trillion emergency education rescue plan. For mostly it's for elementary schools, but also for secondary and the high school, but it's broken down by grade levels. And again, all that is on the website. The House Finance Committee heard bills on adjusting teaching mentorships, where they're just going to possibly require tiers 1 and 2 for new incoming teachers, and adjusting it so that either tier 3 and 4 will be adjusted or go away altogether, just to make it easier for skills and exams for cultural training competency and for first-time teachers. And of course, the governor, you probably already know, the governor passed the summer school extension bill. So that concludes my report.
Excellent, thank you. Director Alt, you have your hand raised.
Thank you, Chair Miller. No report from the Negotiations Committee. The Policy Review Committee met on Monday, March 15th, and we reviewed Policy 624. This has been it's the Electronic Technologies Acceptable Use Policy, and it's been in process now for some time, and it will be coming back to us for another round of review. Hopefully after that next round, it will be coming to the full board with committee's recommendations. And that concludes my report.
Okay, excellent. Any additional board-related appointments or school assignment reports or committee reports to give this evening? All right, hearing none, we'll move to the next and last section of our information portion of our meeting this evening. I have a specific report I'm going to read into the record this evening. Board meeting model during COVID-19. In order for our board meeting format to align to our district's learning model, the Burnsville-Egan Savage School District 191 Board of Education will transition from all virtual board meetings to an in-person meeting format beginning with our next regular scheduled meeting, April 8th. During these in-person meetings, strict social distancing will apply. As is required in all our buildings, masks and shields will be worn. Accommodations will be made for board members or presenters who wish to attend remotely, as allowed under State Statute 13D.021. Although we are not yet going to be open for in-person audience attendance, all board meetings will remain open to the public through online broadcasts. In addition, we will soon be returning to our practice of monthly listening sessions. More information will be available soon. However, we continue to encourage anyone wishing to express their opinions, comments, or questions to email the board using the contact information found on our website. Our priority now is to identify a safe and viable solution which fulfills our responsibility as a district to be open and transparent with our community, while simultaneously protecting the well-being and health of everyone involved. We are all in this together. This ends my report. I would open it up if there's anybody who wants to make a comment or statement on that report. All right, very good.
Chair Miller?
Yes, certainly. Go ahead.
Did you say a date for the listening sessions?
I did not.
Okay.
We haven't consolidated that yet. Traditionally, our listening sessions were every other session, and we'll have to have a little bit further conversation around capacity and technology, as we would prefer probably to have our listening sessions in person, although that opens up present challenges is having people come to the building and how they get in line and all that stuff. So we'll get to that very imminently soon. Director Connor, you have your hand raised?
Yes, I just had one concern for myself and maybe some others, that when we do start the in-person meetings back in our district office, that when a person is presenting, that maybe they would just be able to use the face shield and not the masks also, because I personally have a hard time understanding people with masks on, and that would be a hindrance to me to make sure I'm getting all the clarification I need when people are talking and presenting, and maybe it would be for people listening too. So that's my only concern. And they can always, everybody else that's listening, of course, can have their masks on when they're not talking.
Sure, a valid concern. I will, we will work through Dr. Battle and Bernie, our school health services, to find the best solution. I imagine this is a challenge that we come upon daily in our district otherwise. So we'll, again, our objective here is to model our behavior after what we are asking of our staff and administration. So we'll balance those two as much as we can. Thank you. Absolutely. And you know, based on what was said a little bit, I wrote that note earlier today, but it sounds like it's already possibly changing. It sounds like face shields may not only be an event for us one meeting. If I heard right earlier, Brian, maybe I misunderstood, but we might be phasing those out anyway. So,
well, the face shields.
Yeah, and Director. Yes, so right now we're requiring both a face shield and a face mask as you're interacting in our sites. And so we'll look at that as our numbers of staff members being vaccinated increases. And then also, as you may know, our teachers have amplification systems to help so students can hear. And so we will be putting in some a system amplification, I'm not sure, but communications will send an update to board members so you're aware.
Thank
Excellent. And I want to just reiterate to our fellow board members and anybody presenting that we will continue to offer the opportunity to meet and join us virtually if that is something that makes them more comfortable given their personal circumstances. Okay, with that, we will leave the information section of our meeting this evening and move to the business meeting component. The first up is our consent agenda. Although board action is required, it is generally unnecessary to hold discussion on these items. In the event a board member wishes to discuss an item, that item will be moved for separate consideration. At this time, I will ask if there's any board members that, upon review of the consent agenda, wishes to move one of the items out of the consent agenda. Very well, not seeing any such indication. I will ask for a motion for the consent agenda as in front of us.
So moved.
And
Second.
Very well. A motion by Director Hume and seconded by Director Alt. Therefore, I will ask Ms. Kenny to call the roll.
Chester,
Aye.
Connor,
Aye.
Hume,
Aye.
Miller,
Aye.
Said,
Aye.
Werb,
Aye.
Alt.
Aye.
Excellent. The motion for tonight's consent agenda passes unanimously. At this point, that wraps up the consent agenda. We're moving to new business as there is no new business on tonight's agenda. I will call tonight's regular scheduled meeting to an adjournment, and we will be adjourning to a workshop on our full year 2022 budget. The time currently is 7:51. I suggest that we take a little bit of a leg stretching break. So we'll come back, say at 5 minutes after 8:05.